This is Shalom World Podcast.
Welcome to Voyage. I am your host, Francis Hogan. Welcome to our sharing on the book of Exodus. And I want to share with you from chapter 5 of the book of Exodus, where Moses and Aaron are having their first audience with Pharaoh. And it will turn out to be more and more confrontational as it goes along. So God has told Pharaoh what he wants, and he has threatened him with plague if he doesn't do it. So if God is using that kind of language, then he is demanding a right to be heard. This is not Moses coming along and saying, "Dear Pharaoh, we really appreciate you. You're a wonderful person, and we're asking you a favor." It is absolutely not in that world at all. We're in the world of warfare. It's completely different. So we want to deal with the first reaction of Pharaoh. And the king of Egypt said in verse 4 to Moses and Aaron, "What do you mean by taking the people away from their work, the only value they had as far as Pharaoh is concerned? Get back to your laboring." Now, Pharaoh is saying that to Moses and Aaron to get back to their laboring. In other words, he's dealing with them as miserable Hebrews. He's going to get his eyes opened, and he's going to have respect for Moses and Aaron very shortly. "Get back to your laboring," he said. "Now that these common people have grown in such numbers, do you want to stop them from laboring? In other words, now that our workforce is decent enough for me to be able to build the store cities of Pithom and Ramses, are you going to stop our laboring?" In other words, labor is the only issue, and the Hebrew people are only useful for labor. So there's no other subject. And because there's no other subject in Pharaoh's mind, of course that's going to be changed radically. That same day, we're told in verse 6, Pharaoh gave this command to the people's slave drivers and to the overseers: "Up to the present you have provided these people with straw for brick making. Do so no longer. Let them go and gather the straw for themselves. At the same time, you will demand the same number of bricks." In other words, an awful lot more labor to produce the same results. And then it goes on in verse 8 to say, they are lazy. Now, these people are building the store cities of Pithom and Ramses. Nobody can call them lazy. These people are lazy. That's why their cry is, "Let us go and serve our God." It's an extraordinary reaction from a man who himself is responsible to keep Egypt worshipping their gods. It doesn't make any sense. But of course, if you have decided that a people has no value except as slave labor, then you are not looking at them as people. The them and the us have a huge gulf between them. And so what is the Lord going to do? He's going to pull the mighty from their thrones, and he's going to raise up the lowly. That's the way he does things. So make these men work harder than ever so that they've no time to stop and listen to glib speeches. Oh, this is very important. This is the world and its thinking. Anybody talking about God or talking about the truth of spiritual reality and spiritual warfare and God intervening in the human race, anything to do with true religion, is glib speeches. Any person coming along saying they've had a genuine encounter with God, when all of them know that their gods are false gods really, and they think they can manipulate these powers through the occult. So if someone comes along who has had a genuine encounter with God, that's just considered nonsense, because they know that their own religion is nonsense, but they're not going to face it. They have to be forced to face it. So the people's slave drivers went out with the overseers to speak to them. Now, there are slave drivers operating under Pharaoh, and there are 4 men representing the poor slaves on the ground. And these two meet, and the message from Pharaoh is given to them. Now notice, Pharaoh, the slave drivers, the 4 men, the people. I've pointed out to you that the message from God is from God to Moses, Moses to Aaron, Aaron to Pharaoh, Pharaoh to the people. That is the line of communication. So they understand this hierarchy of communication. So we're told in verse 12 that the poor people had to scatter all over the land looking for the straw, but they couldn't produce the same number of bricks because they spent so much time looking for the straw to make the bricks. So we're told that the slave drivers harassed them. That obviously means they're beaten up. Every day you are to complete your daily quota, they said, the same as before when we provided the straw for you. The 4 men who had been appointed for the sons of Israel by Pharaoh's slave drivers were flogged. So now the representatives of the slaves are being tormented by the representatives of the slaver. Things have got an awful lot worse. And so we have moved on a good bit, and we need to understand what's actually going on in the background and why this is actually happening. Okay. First of all, as I said, those representing the world consider anything to do with true religion and anything coming directly from God as absolutely glib speeches. Unbelievers do not accept that people have had encounters with God. They don't accept the miraculous. They don't accept those representing God. And what they do is, in order to stop the ordinary people from hearing the message from God. Now, it came from God to Moses, and Moses to the leaders of Israel, and the leaders of Israel to the people. Now, to stop that particular line of communication, what the other line of communication does is to make their lives so unbearable that they won't listen to anybody. And they do succeed temporarily. And Pharaoh succeeds, at least in the beginning, because we don't like being flogged and we don't like being forced into absolutely unbearable situations. So we're told also that the reason why the people are getting religious is that they're lazy and that they want to listen to some God. Now, that is definitely not coming from Pharaoh himself, because he himself worships his gods. Okay? And all of these 4 men and all of these slave drivers, they were all worshipping their own gods. So that is coming from the hidden power, hidden in the dark behind them, influencing them, that wants to tell everybody that worshipping God is a waste of time. Now, if you come into our modern life, 3 millennia after the true redemption, the full redemption through Christ, you find exactly the same thing going on, but on a much more sophisticated level. That modern employers have discovered how to demand so much from their employees that the amount of time that has to be given to produce this effect is so outrageous that the people have no time for God and the people have no time for religion. They come home and they're absolutely wrecked with tiredness. The only time they have to do any kind of homework is on Sundays, when they should be giving time to God. Yeah, that spirit is still there, still telling us that anything to do with religion is simply glib speeches, that there's no reality to this invisible God. That's the challenge of Satan to us all the time. And the issue for the modern world, as well as for Pharaoh, is simply work. You must produce this amount of work. And it doesn't matter how much time you have to spend on it. So this is one of the principles of spiritual warfare. And it's extremely important, because if it has happened to you and nobody told you about it, you will think there's something wrong. And that is that as soon as the individual or a group or a church or a nation decides to get serious about God and about God's word in the Holy Bible and God's worship in the liturgy, as soon as we get serious about it, then Satan moves in and puts pressure on us to make our lives absolutely unbearable, so that there isn't time for it. There isn't time for God. There isn't time to even think. Let me give you a very simple example of a person I tried to help some time ago. He was an alcoholic, and it's a very long story. I'm just going to give you the bit that I want to illustrate, and that is, we came to this point where he was really willing to be freed from this addiction, and the Lord was using me to try and help him. And we were doing well, and he came to me one day and he said, "A strange thing is happening and I need to tell you." I said, "What is it?" He said, "When I was on the alcohol binge," he said, Nobody ever offered me a drink, ever. But now he said that I'm trying to come away from it and I'm trying to put the alcohol behind me. He said, you won't believe the number of people who are offering me free drinks. I said, oh, that's a very important point, and I'm glad you told me, because as soon as the soul wants to become free, Satan puts the boot in to try and get you back into slavery and to get you back into despair. He wants you to be so crushed that you will get back into despair, thinking it can't happen for me, and so the suicidal thoughts come. And so we just need to be aware of that, and we need to understand that God is greater than Satan. He who dwells within me is greater than he who is outside. That's very, very important. And we need to put God between us and those blocks. Remember I said before to put grace between us and our problems. Well, now we put God himself standing between us and Satan. That's actually very important. Satan never gives up, either for the individual, the group, the nation, or the world. He never gives up without a very, very bitter struggle. And in fact, the Bible testifies that no matter that the testimony is this large, Satan doesn't give up until he's finally conquered at the very end of the Bible in Revelation 20 and 21. He doesn't give up. And so we mustn't be surprised that this opposition actually comes to us. Okay. When a person like my friend, the alcoholic, is coming to God, hope is born in their lives, and it's the hope of new life, of grace and of healing, and of being able to get back to some level of normality. And then this comes in to push you back down again and to crush you back from hope to despair. That's actually what Satan is trying to do. So we need to understand the temptations that people have at the very beginning of their spiritual lives, because these temptations are very serious and will direct the journey that you're going to take. So the poor slaves have the four men who are representing them to the slave drivers, and the four men make two major mistakes that we have to watch out for in our own personal lives and in the life of the church and so on. And that is, they go to Pharaoh asking Pharaoh to please be nice. What they don't seem to realize is that Pharaoh is trying to destroy them. He wants to actually destroy them. He was the one who ordered the killing of all the boys. He wants this nation destroyed. How can you go to your enemy and ask him to be a nice enemy? That doesn't make sense. And the second mistake that they're going to make, and I'll give you both, one after the other, is that they will blame Moses and Aaron and reject Moses for the second time. Very serious. So you can't ask a slave driver to be nice to you. You can't ask the devil to be nice to you. It's not actually possible. He wants your destruction. See, you don't have any truck with him, whatever. This is what we read in the second book of Chronicles, chapter 32 and verse 8. He, that is the enemy, has only an arm of flesh, but we have Yahweh. We have our God to help us. And we have our God to fight our battles. So don't look at the enemy, look at Yahweh. But you see, the very attack that Satan puts on you makes you look at the problem. In the New Testament, we read in the first letter of John, chapter 4 and verse 4, greater is he that is within me than he that is in the world. He that is within me is the Lord himself. That is the presence of God in the burning bush. And he that is in the world is merely a creature, even though he's a high-ranking angel. Okay, so greater is he that is in me than he that is in the world. It is extremely important at the beginning of our spiritual journey that we understand who God is, who the enemy is, and who we are. That was what Moses learned in the wilderness. And it's extremely important for all of us. So the second move, as I say, that they made, which was completely wrong, was to turn around and to blame Moses and Aaron for everything. So let's look at this. This is from verse 15. 4 men of the sons of Israel went to Pharaoh and they complained, why do you treat your servants so? They're not the servants of Pharaoh. They're his slaves. No straw is provided for your servants, and the cry is more bricks. and now your servants have been flogged. And so Pharaoh said, you are lazy, you are lazy. That's exactly what he said to Moses and Aaron as well. Let us go and sacrifice to the Lord your God. You see, Pharaoh didn't like the idea of sacrifice. They didn't sacrifice to their gods. They worshipped the animals that Israel would sacrifice to God. And so it was abhorrent to him that they would actually sacrifice an animal. Get back to your work at once, he said, and you shall not get the straw, and you have to deliver the number of bricks that were required. So this completely unreasonable situation is actually put upon them. Now, this is the second problem that they have. That's from verse 19. The foremen for the sons of Israel saw themselves in a very difficult position because they were going to be flogged to force their own people to do work that they really weren't able to do. So, verse 20 said, as they left Pharaoh's palace, they met Moses and Aaron, who were waiting for them. In other words, they didn't invite Moses and Aaron to come into this interview. And Moses and Aaron were the only representatives of God. The four men shouldn't have done it. So poor Moses and Aaron, learning humility, the fast track, are waiting for them. And the four men said, may the Lord see your work and punish you as you deserve. You have made us hated by Pharaoh and his court. They have not done that. Pharaoh hated the people of Israel anyway. You saw that at the very beginning of the text, and he just simply wanted to destroy them. But what the four men are doing now is putting the blame on two innocent people. This is one of the great mistakes many people make, is to blame somebody else. Blaming is always wrong. You have to see the truth of what's going on. So, may the Lord punish you as you deserve. You have made us hated by Pharaoh and his court. You have put a sword in their hand to kill us, but he has been killing the boys, the children, anyway. So here you have these men who are upset and angry, and because they're upset and angry, they put a spin on the story that doesn't exist in reality. What does Moses do? Once more Moses turned to the Lord. Why didn't the four men turn to the Lord? Why didn't the slaves in the fields turn to the Lord? It's because those slaves in the fields actually need to go through a whole conversion process in the plagues. They are not converted to the Lord. Not at all. The religion they have is more of a tradition than anything else. So Moses turned to the Lord and he said, Lord, why do you treat your people like this? Why do you let them be treated so harshly? Why did you send me here? Ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak to him in your name, he has ill-treated this nation, and you've done nothing to deliver your people. Oh dear. Moses has passed the blame on to God. He's saying to God, you promised to deliver these people. You told me that if I came and I made this sign about the snake to Pharaoh, that everything was going to be okay. They all think the exodus is going to be immediate. It's not going to be immediate. It doesn't work like that. And so you can see that Moses too has a lot to learn. Moses was expecting to be rejected by Pharaoh because God had warned him about that in chapter 4, that he would get stiff resistance from Pharaoh and that he was to persevere. But he wasn't expecting to be rejected by the leadership of the chosen people. Now, he got his first rejection before he went to the land of Midian. He was certainly not expecting it when he came back. Just as Jesus was rejected, that led to his passion and death, and he came back in the resurrection, and he wouldn't have been expecting the people of Israel to reject him in his victory and glory and power, but they did. It's extraordinary. You're told immediately that Moses turned to the Lord. And one of the things that is illustrated literally from this moment towards right to the end of the book of Exodus is the extraordinary prayer life that this man had. God was present to him. We read in the book of Numbers in chapter 12 that he could actually see the form of the Lord and that God spoke to him face to face. That's in Numbers 12, verses 1 to 3. And so you can see that Moses is present to the Lord. When God called him, he said, I am here. That means I am present to you. You are present to me, but I am also present to you. If we are to have a prayer life, that has to happen to us as well. That not only is God present to us, we have to be present to him. And the more you keep that presence with you, 24/7, 365, the closer you'll get to God. And his power is there available to you all the time, and his mercy and his forgiveness and everything else. So Moses develops this, what I can only call a spectacular prayer life, that he speaks, God hears, he asks, God acts. It's absolutely brilliant. And Moses begins to do something which is absolutely essential if you're going to take this journey successfully, if you're going to be a representative of God in any capacity, if you're going to take this journey. And that is, you have to put yourself aside. You've got to start forgetting yourself and your own feelings and your own needs and your own this and that and the other. That's the exact opposite of the world that tells you to project yourself, assert yourself, proclaim yourself, do everything for self, self, self. So Moses begins to put himself aside. And the thing you see uppermost in all his communication with God is, you asked me to do something. I'm trying to do it. I'm having this problem. What is the next thing? What do you want? And so it's the staff in hand. He is leaning on God for absolutely everything. He knows in his experience what Jesus proclaimed in John 15:5, without me, you can do nothing. Moses realizes that. And so he turns to the Lord. Of course, I had prayed to God earlier in his life, and particularly in the desert of Midian for 40 years. But that was internal and it was personal. This is completely different. This is this dialogue in which Moses is God's representative on the earth. And so it puts the prayer life on a completely different footing. And Moses has already experienced God's forgiveness and God's mercy and God's love. But now he has got to pull that forgiveness to the people, the mercy to the people, and everything else for the people. He's got to actually be the conduit that it will go out to God. And he has to learn, as well as everybody else, that the troubles get worse before they get better. I'm sure you've experienced that in your own life as well. Whenever anybody's trying to solve a problem, even if it's physical or medical or mental or spiritual or anything, the problem always seems to get worse before it gets better. Because as soon as you begin to try and touch it, then the complications turn up. It's these very circumstances that God is going to use. It's going to look like a delay, but it isn't actually a delay. Because God is going to use the present circumstances where the slavery has become worse in order to get these people willing to leave the country and go elsewhere. It's a massive decision to get an entire people to get up and leave an area and go somewhere else. Absolutely massive. And it's also going to be a miracle of God that these people would truly put their trust in God and that they would follow him, and that not only would they look at Moses, they would look at God as their shepherd. And you'll see that this is accomplished initially at the Red Sea, where when they see the victory over Pharaoh and his army, that they actually put their trust in God and in Moses as their leader. So let's come to chapter 6. Chapter 6 gives us some revision and some background that we actually need to look at. Some of this I've already said to you, but there's one or two bits I want to emphasize. We need to understand the drama that's about to unfold and everything that is behind it. So let me actually read the first few verses and you'll realize why we have to cover some territory we covered before. This is chapter 6 from verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, "You will see how I will punish Pharaoh." He does see that at the Red Sea. "He will be forced to let you go, and he will be forced to send them out of the land. In other words, you won't just leave it, you'll actually be thrown out. And then we're told in verses 2 and 3 that God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Yahweh. That's the tetragrammaton YHWH, or I am who I am, usually translated Yahweh at this point. Now, watch this. I dealt with this partly before. To Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, I appeared as El Shaddai, that is, God Almighty. I did not make myself known to them by the name of Yahweh. That's why I brought up that problem about the different translations actually using the name Yahweh incorrectly in certain places. I did not make myself known to them by the name of Yahweh. Also, I made my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land they lived in as strangers. And I have heard the groaning of the sons of Israel enslaved by the Egyptians, and I've remembered my covenant. We've had this before. So say this to the sons of Israel, and he begins to give them some instructions. Now, I looked into this, and I want to show you the problem of Yahweh again, so that we're actually clear about it, and beware of translations. It's very clear here, I did not make myself known to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as Yahweh. So let's look at this. In Genesis 13:4, Abraham, we're told, called upon the name of the Lord. So what does the Lord mean? The Lord is written as the Lord in English with the Septuagint, the King James, the Masoretic text, and the Daweh version, and others that I just didn't have time to go into. And it's written as Yahweh in the Jerusalem Bible, which is incorrect, and also in the Christian Community Bible. So he said he didn't reveal himself as Yahweh to Abraham. Isaac called upon the name of the Lord in Genesis 26:25, and again, the same translations use the term the Lord, which is Adonai, and the same two translations use Yahweh, that is the Jerusalem Bible and the CCB. Thirdly, in Genesis 32:9-10, Jacob called upon the name of the Lord, and the Lord is given with the same number of testimonies, and Yahweh is written down by Jerusalem Bible and CCB. So Jerusalem Bible and CCB are using Yahweh in the wrong place. They're presuming. And so they will conclude that what you read here is simply a rehash of the same story. But either God said he revealed himself in a particular way or he didn't. So if the patriarchs called upon the Lord, what did they mean by the Lord? And it is explained to you here in verse 3, I revealed myself as El Shaddai. The very first name given to God is El, E-L. And El Shaddai literally means God of the mountains, or the God Almighty, because the mountains were considered mighty. The other word that is used right in the first line of the book of Genesis is Elohim, with a capital E. And that is the plural for God in the persons that is in God. But elsewhere you will find the word Elohim with the small e used in reference to angels and angelic beings, whether they are good or bad, or gods. So I put gods in inverted commas. Now, whether the Egyptians called their false gods Elohim or not, I couldn't tell you at this moment. Because what you will find later in the struggle with idolatry is that the names given to the false gods were partly similar to the names given to God, and the ordinary people were completely confused. The thing that is important here in the book of Exodus is that Yahweh, translated as the Lord in English, or Adonai, means the God of the covenant, as the covenant of Moses. As it's speaking about God's covenant love, and that covenant love is usually written as Hesed. Okay, so if Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were dealing with El Shaddai, they were dealing with the God of the universe, or the Creator. And the second one, we're dealing with our Lord, my Lord, the God of the covenant, the one who redeemed me. So let me give you two titles for God now. The first one is Creator, and the second one is Redeemer. And so it's important that we'd actually just distinguish the two of them, because it can be very confusing. Here in the Exodus, we're going to see that the promises made by the Creator to Abraham and passed on to Isaac and Jacob are going to be fulfilled. So he's the God who keeps his promises. And we will therefore know him in a completely new way. Now, one of the fascinating things about the book of Exodus is that through all the drama that happens, God reveals himself as Creator, Lord, Redeemer, Friend, Father, Provider, Healer, Teacher, Guide, Shepherd, Light, Fire, Love, anything you can think of. Everything that is our need, he reveals himself to us, which I've already dealt with. So it's a completely different revelation to the revelation that was given to Abraham. Therefore, Moses' generation and all the generations that came after him in the covenant of Moses knew God in a much, much deeper way than Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob ever did. And then when you come to the fulfillment in the New Testament, and we find that God actually became incarnate among them, then we know God in a way that Moses and his entire people of all history couldn't even imagine. So as history moves on, the revelation gets deeper and deeper and deeper. But that's the way it is in relationships, isn't it? You think you know somebody at the beginning, but it's only when you commit yourself to that person and live with them, you begin to really know them. And then as both of you mature, as life goes on, and you go through trials and difficulties together, that is when the knowledge becomes so much deeper. And you begin to know the mystery of the person you're living with. And you've come to touch the mystery of yourself as well. When you go back to Genesis 15, that was the promise that was given for the liberation from oppression. And in Genesis 17 was the covenant which prescribed circumcision. So that covenant with Abraham was made in the land that God actually promised to give to the people. It was made in the land of Canaan. Okay. So he's going to perform all his promises, bring them all to fruition here in the book of Exodus. In Exodus 6 and 5, we're told that God remembered that he had promised to do this. And I've already said to you that at the beginning of Luke's Gospel, in the Benedictus, we are also told that God remembered his promise to Abraham and his sons forever in sending the Savior, who is Jesus. Now that he remembers his covenant, he has the liberator ready. Before I move on, I went through the Bible looking for any reference I could find to I am he. I am he, or as I am who I am he. Okay. And it's very, very interesting. I'm only going to give you a tiny flavor of this because I want you to get into the Bible and really look at the treasure that's there. Isaiah 43:13 says, I am your God. I am he from eternity. Now notice the I am he from eternity. No one can deliver from my hand. I act and no one can reverse it. Now the whole book of Exodus proves that. Isaiah 52:6, my people will therefore know my name. Now the name Hashem means the person. The other way to say that is, my people will know me. And when you come to the gospel, you have Jesus revealing God in the most profound and extraordinary way. And you have that wonderful moment on the Easter day when one of the sheep hears the voice of the shepherd and recognizes him and goes off to proclaim he is risen from the dead. Matthew 14:27, be of good courage. I am he. Be not afraid. So on the waters of the Sea of Galilee, in the night, he proclaims who he is. Matthew 26:64, I am he. John 4:26, speaking to the Samaritan woman, Jesus said, I am he. I'm actually speaking to you. John 8:24, if you do not believe that I am he, you will die in your sins. John 8:28, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he. In other words, everybody knew in the resurrection who Jesus was. And John 18:6, just before he was arrested, Jesus said, I am he, and they all fell to the ground. So the I am he of the Lord is responded to, I am here in the Lord's servant. We're both present to each other for this wonderful mystery of this relationship with God that leads to not only the redemption of the soul, but to its full liberation and to its sanctification and eventual glorification. So God speaks here now, and he gives 7 promises here in chapter 6. He says, well, he makes 7 statements, I should say. He said, I've heard their groaning. I've remembered my covenant. And so what I'm going to do is, so they're the 2 statements he makes. So he says, I'm now going to give you a 7-fold blessing. I will free you from your burdens. I will release you from your slavery. I will deliver you, which means I will redeem you. I will adopt you as my people. I will be your God, and you will know me as the Redeemer. Number 6, I will bring you to the promised land, and I will give you an inheritance. Why? How can I do this? He said, because I, the Lord, Yahweh, your Redeemer, will do this. That's the incredible thing that's written down there. Well, I want you to notice that if you actually go back to the time of Abraham in the book of Genesis in chapter 17, God also said 7 things to Abraham. But I want you to notice the difference. That's the reason why I'm bringing them up. The you here in chapter 6 of the book of Exodus is the whole people of God, the 12 tribes, including Moses and Aaron. Back in Genesis 17, you was also used, but it was personal, individual. It was Abraham. I will make you, Abraham, exceedingly fruitful. I will make nations out of you, Abraham, and kings will come from you. Number 3, I will establish my covenant with you, Abraham, and therefore with your seed forever. I will give you, Abraham, the promised land, the land in which you are a stranger. It will be your everlasting possession. Now that you and your involves his descendants as well. And then he goes to the descendants. I will be their God and they will be my people. And then I will establish my covenant with Isaac, your son, and with Israel, Jacob, your grandson. So the patriarchs were going to experience God making personal promises to them, which would go down to their descendants. Now he's speaking directly to the descendants here in the Exodus. I want to give you another 7 promises before we go, and that is if you go down a few centuries to the time of Jeremiah, this time Jeremiah has seen that the first people of God that came out in the Exodus actually failed God terribly, just as we in the present generations have failed God terribly as well. And so he began to tell them about a new covenant that was coming. And so this new covenant, which was in the future for Jeremiah and which we have experienced, he said, I will put my law into their hearts, into their interior. In other words, it will become spiritual. Do you remember Jesus said to the Samaritan woman that those who worship me will worship in spirit and in truth? I think he said those who worship the Father will worship in spirit and in truth. So I will write it on their hearts. I will be their God. They will be my people. They will all know God. So this is knowing God at a much deeper level, because the revelation that was to be given through the new covenant of Jesus was to be interior to all of us. And I will forgive their sins and no longer remember their iniquities. So the incredible thing is that these wonderful promises that have just been given here in the book of Exodus are given to a people who are described this way in verse 9. I, the Lord, will do all of this, he said to Moses. And Moses told this to the sons of Israel, but they wouldn't listen to him. So crushed was their spirit, and so cruel was their slavery. If you are really crushed in spirit, good news can come to you as bad news, because it seems to you that it's so outlandish, it couldn't possibly apply to you. And so this was the first major attack on the people, so that Satan would crush them in spirit so they could no longer hear the good news. And the pressures that are in the world today are on so many, not only individuals, but populations are making it impossible for them to even believe in God anymore. Satan hasn't given up. We're heading into a mighty battle under the Antichrist. Thanks for listening. Slán agus beannacht déilibh. Goodbye. God bless you.
Thank you for joining us today. We'd like to hear what you thought of today's session. Share your feedback with us at podcast@shalomworld.org. You can motivate and support us today. shalomworld.org/donate. Visit shalomworld.org for more information about Shalom World podcasts. To get the latest updates, make sure you follow us on Instagram at Shalom World Podcasts. Shalom World Podcasts is now available on all online platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and others.